My name is Kaitlyn, and I just turned 27 years old today. What should have been a happy celebration at an upscale Chicago restaurant quickly turned into the most shocking moment of my life. While my parents nervously watched my billionaire grandfather Walter, who rarely shows up at family gatherings, smiled warmly and asked, "Is the apartment comfortable?" When I replied, "What apartment?" my parents literally froze in their seats. The look on Grandpa's face changed instantly as he turned to them and asked in an eerily calm voice, "Then where did the money go?" If you're watching this from somewhere around the world, make sure to hit like and subscribe to hear about the family betrayal that completely changed my life and taught me who I could really trust. Before everything fell apart that night, I was living what I thought was a normal life. I worked as a graphic designer at a small agency in downtown Chicago, making just enough to cover my bills and occasionally treat myself to a nice coffee. My apartment was nothing special, a 2-bedroom in a slightly run-down building that I shared with my roommate Olivia. The rent was steep, even split between us, but that was city living for you. Our place had character, though, with mismatched furniture we had collected over the years and walls covered in art prints and photographs. Despite having a billionaire grandfather, I was proud of making my own way. My parents, Harold and Diane, lived a comfortable, upper-middle-class life in the suburbs. They had a 5-bedroom house with a pool and took lavish vacations twice a year. I always assumed they were doing well because my dad had a senior position at an insurance company and my mom worked in real estate. They never offered financial help, always emphasizing the importance of working for what you want. When I graduated from art school 4 years ago with nearly $70,000 in student loans, they congratulated me on taking my first steps into adulthood. While other parents helped with down payments or covered a few months of rent to help their kids get started, mine handed me a copy of Dave Ramsey and told me building character through struggle was important. I never resented them for it, not really. I was determined to prove I could make it on my own. But there were times when things got really tight that I wondered why they seemed so reluctant to help, especially when they would show up in a new luxury car or talk about the kitchen remodel they were planning. Grandpa Walter was an enigma to me. He had built his fortune in real estate development, starting with nothing and eventually creating one of the largest property companies in the Midwest. He was stern, intimidating, and rarely attended family functions. When he did show up, everyone walked on eggshells around him. But despite his gruff exterior, he always had a soft spot for me. On the rare occasions we spoke, he would ask thoughtful questions about my design work and actually listen to my answers. My cousin Natalie was the only one in our generation who seemed to have benefited from the family wealth. She had a trust fund that gave her a very comfortable lifestyle. She never worked a day in her life, but constantly posted photos from exotic locations and high-end restaurants on social media. Whenever we were at family gatherings together, she would talk about her latest shopping spree or vacation in a way that felt deliberately designed to highlight the differences in our situations. The week before my birthday had been particularly rough. The design agency I worked for lost a major client, and I was among the 5 employees who got laid off. With just enough savings to cover maybe 2 months of expenses, I was panicking about how I would make rent while searching for a new job in a competitive field. When my parents called to insist on taking me out for a fancy birthday dinner, I tried to decline. I suggested we do something simple instead, maybe order takeout at my apartment. But they were adamant, saying 27 was a special birthday and deserved a proper celebration. Looking back, their insistence makes sense now in a twisted way. There had been signs something was off, little things I brushed aside at the time. Like when I mentioned possibly going back to school for a master's degree and my dad immediately shut down the conversation saying I already had enough student debt. Or how my mom would quickly change the subject whenever I talked about my financial struggles. There were hushed phone conversations that would stop when I entered the room and strange tension whenever Grandpa Walter was mentioned. A few months earlier, I had caught my mom looking at properties in Panama online. When I asked if they were planning a vacation, she quickly closed her laptop and said she was just daydreaming. My dad had also been making odd comments about how we might not see each other as often in the future because they were thinking about traveling more. The morning of my birthday, Olivia gave me a handmade card and a small potted plant she knew I had been eyeing at the local nursery. We had been friends since college, and she knew better than anyone how hard I had been working just to stay afloat. As I got ready for dinner with my parents that night, she helped me put together an outfit that would look nice but was still within my limited wardrobe. I would never have guessed that in just a few hours, everything I thought I knew about my family would be shattered beyond repair. Or that the financial struggles I had been facing for years were completely unnecessary. As I applied my mascara and put on my only pair of decent earrings, I had no idea I was about to discover the most painful betrayal imaginable. The restaurant my parents chose for my birthday dinner was one of those places where the menu has no prices listed, which immediately made me uncomfortable. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and the tables were dressed in crisp white linens. The hostess led us to a table in the center of the dining room where my parents had already arranged for a bottle of champagne to be waiting on ice. I felt immediately out of place in my simple black dress and the same heels I had worn to job interviews for the past 3 years. My mother was draped in a designer outfit I had never seen before, with a necklace that probably cost more than my rent. My father wore an expensive-looking suit with gold cufflinks that caught the light when he reached for his water glass. The conversation felt forced from the beginning. They asked surface-level questions about my job search, but changed the subject whenever I expressed any real concern. Instead, they kept steering the conversation toward safe topics like a movie they had recently seen or updates about distant relatives I barely knew. After we ordered, they presented me with their gifts, a designer wallet and a scarf that, while beautiful, seemed strangely modest considering the restaurant they had chosen. As I thanked them, my mother launched into a familiar lecture about financial responsibility and the importance of building good credit. I was halfway through my entree, nodding along to another of my father's stories about his college days, when the atmosphere in the restaurant suddenly shifted. People at nearby tables straightened in their seats, and the staff became noticeably more attentive. I turned to see what had caused the change, and spotted him immediately. Grandpa Walter had arrived accompanied by his assistant Jennifer, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s, who was rarely more than a few steps away from him. At 82, Walter still cut an imposing figure, tall and straight-backed with a full head of silver hair. He wore a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than my yearly salary, and his presence commanded attention without him having to say a word. My parents froze mid-conversation, their expressions shifting from surprise to something that looked almost like fear. My father stood quickly, nearly knocking over his water glass in the process. "Walter, this is unexpected," he said, his voice higher than normal. "We weren't sure you would make it." My grandfather ignored him completely, focusing his attention on me instead. His stern expression softened as he approached our table. "Happy birthday, Kaitlyn," he said, leaning down to kiss my cheek. His cologne smelled expensive like leather and cedar. 27 years. Hard to believe how quickly time passes. "Thank you, Grandpa," I replied, genuinely touched that he had remembered. "It means a lot that you came." He took the empty seat beside me, while Jennifer remained standing, tablet in hand, as if ready to take notes at any moment. "I wanted to check in on how things are going," he said, studying my face with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Jennifer tells me the quarterly reports for your investment portfolio look strong. The trust should be performing well in this market." I blinked in confusion. "Investment portfolio trust?" A slight furrow appeared between his eyebrows. "Yes, the trust fund established when you were born. You turned 25 2 years ago, so everything should have been transferred to your control by now." He spoke as if this was common knowledge. My parents were suddenly very interested in their plates. My mother's knuckles had turned white around her fork. "I think there might be some confusion," I said slowly, looking between my grandfather and my parents. "I don't have a trust fund." Walter's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "Of course you do. Your cousins as well, though. Yours was the largest. 5 million initially, plus growth. Managed by your parents until your 25th birthday when control was to transfer to you." The restaurant around us seemed to fade away as I struggled to process what he was saying. $5 million, a trust fund I never knew about. It made no sense. And the apartment in Gold Coast. Walter continued, his voice pleasant, but his eyes now fixed on my parents. Is it comfortable? I selected that building specifically because of the security and the views of the lake. What apartment? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was deafening. My father had gone pale and my mother looked like she might be sick. Walter's expression remained calm, but there was a dangerous stillness to him now, like the moment before a storm breaks. You don't know about the apartment, he said. It wasn't a question. The 2-bedroom corner unit in the Lakeside Tower, purchased 2 years ago as your 25th birthday present. I shook my head slowly, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. Walter turned to my parents with deliberate slowness, his voice dropping to a quiet tone that was somehow more frightening than if he had shouted. Then where did the money go? My father started to speak, a tremor in his voice. Walter, there's been a misunderstanding. We can explain everything. I sincerely hope so, my grandfather replied, his tone making it clear he didn't believe there was any explanation that would satisfy him. He turned to his assistant. Jennifer, please call Stanley and have him meet us here immediately. Already done, sir, Jennifer replied efficiently. He was at a dinner nearby and should arrive within 10 minutes. I've also contacted security at the office to pull all the relevant financial records. The other diners were openly staring now the drama at our table, apparently more interesting than their expensive meals. A waiter hovered nearby, unsure whether to approach. My mother reached across the table for my hand, but I pulled away, a sick feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. Kaitlyn, sweetheart, this isn't how we wanted to tell you. Tell me what I demanded, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm, that I have a trust fund and an apartment I never knew about, or that somehow you kept them from me. My father glanced nervously around at the other diners. This isn't the place to discuss family matters. I agree, Walter said coldly. Jennifer, please arrange for a private room. He turned to me, his expression softening slightly. Kaitlyn, I promise you will get answers tonight. All of them. As Jennifer spoke quietly to the restaurant manager, I sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the past years of financial struggle with what I had just learned. Why would my parents keep this from me? What had they done with the money that was apparently meant for me? And how would I ever trust them again? The private dining room the restaurant provided had dark wood paneling and a long table that could seat 12, making our small group look even more isolated. Walter sat at the head of the table with me to his right. My parents sat across from me, both looking like they wanted to be anywhere else. Jennifer positioned herself near the door tablet, ready, her face professionally blank. We were joined shortly by Stanley Thornton, my grandfather's longtime attorney, a balding man with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He carried a leather briefcase that he placed carefully on the table. I took the liberty of bringing the original trust documents, he said to Walter, as well as the most recent financial statements. Walter nodded. Good. Let's start at the beginning. For Kaitlyn's benefit. Stanley cleared his throat and addressed me directly. When you were born, your grandfather established a trust fund in your name with an initial deposit of $5 million. The terms were straightforward. The trust would be managed by your parents as trustees until your 25th birthday, at which point control would transfer entirely to you. The only stipulations were that the money could be used for your education, health, and general welfare prior to your 25th birthday, with all expenditures documented and approved. I stared at him in disbelief. And no one thought to tell me about this. Your parents were instructed to inform you about the trust when you turned 18, Stanley replied, glancing at my father and mother. Based on your reaction, I gather that didn't happen. It did not, Walter confirmed, his voice tight with controlled anger. Nor apparently did the transfer of assets at 25. He turned to Stanley. What is the current value of Kaitlyn's trust? Stanley pulled several documents from his briefcase and placed them on the table. According to the most recent statement from 3 months ago, the trust had grown to approximately $8.3 million. This includes the original principal plus investment growth minus authorized expenditures for college tuition and the purchase of the Gold Coast apartment 2 years ago. $8.3 million. The number seemed impossible. While I had been working overtime and skipping meals to make rent, there had been millions of dollars that belonged to me that was supposed to be used for my benefit. I want to see proof of all withdrawals from the trust over the past 5 years, Walter said to Stanley. As the attorney produced more documents, my father finally spoke up. Walter, we can explain. There were investments that didn't perform as expected. The money is just temporarily allocated elsewhere. Allocated where exactly? Walter asked with dangerous calm. My mother jumped in. Harold, just tell the truth. She turned to Walter with tears in her eyes. There were some financial difficulties after the recession. We had to make some adjustments. By stealing from your daughter, Walter's voice was ice cold. It wasn't stealing, my father protested weakly. We're her parents. We were looking out for her best interests. I found my voice at last. By letting me struggle with student loans in a tiny apartment with a roommate while you lived in a 5-bedroom house with a pool, by watching me stress about making rent while you bought new cars and went on luxury vacations, how exactly was that in my best interest? Jennifer quietly placed a glass of water in front of me. I hadn't realized I was shaking until I tried to pick it up and nearly spilled it. Stanley had been examining the financial records with a growing frown. There appear to be numerous unauthorized withdrawals beginning approximately 7 years ago, large sums transferred to personal accounts belonging to Harold and Diane. He looked up, his expression grim. Based on my preliminary review, it appears that all but approximately $300,000 has been diverted from the trust. The room went silent. $8 million reduced to $300,000. I felt physically ill. Where is the money now? Walter asked, his calm voice belying the fury evident in his eyes. My father looked down at his hands. Some of it went to pay off our mortgage. Some for cars, renovations to the house, investments in Diane's real estate business. Vacations, my mother added quietly. The house in Florida. Memories flashed through my mind, painful in their new context. My parents declining to help with my security deposit on my first apartment after college, telling me that my student loan burden was good character building when I expressed anxiety about the payments. My mother showing off her new Mercedes while I took the bus to work because I couldn't afford car payments, all while they had access to millions of dollars that was meant for me. You let me struggle, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. All those years, all those sleepless nights worrying about money. You watched me work 2 jobs during college. You saw how stressed I was about being laid off last week. My voice grew stronger with my anger. And you had my money the whole time. You were living off my trust fund, while letting me think I was on my own. It wasn't like that. My mother insisted, tears streaming down her face now. We always intended to pay it back. Things just got out of hand. Out of hand, I repeated incredulously. You stole nearly $8 million from me. Walter placed a steadying hand on my arm. Jennifer, please call Detective Ramirez. I believe he's still with the Financial Crimes Unit. Walter, no, my father exclaimed. There's no need to involve the police. This is a family matter. Theft is a criminal matter, Walter replied coldly. Particularly at this scale. Please, my mother begged. We can fix this. We can sell the house, the cars, pay it back. Walter looked at me. Kaitlyn, this is ultimately your decision. They stole from you. Press charges or not, it's your call. I looked across the table at my parents, these people I had trusted implicitly my entire life. The shock was giving way to a deep, aching sense of betrayal that I knew would never fully heal. I need time to think, I managed to say. I can't process all of this right now. Walter nodded. A reasonable request. He turned to Stanley. In the meantime, I want all their assets frozen. Nothing moves without my approval, and I want a full forensic accounting of every penny that left that trust. Already initiated, Jennifer said from her position by the door. The team will work through the night if necessary. And the apartment? Stanley asked. Have the locks changed immediately, Walter instructed. New keys to be given only to Kaitlyn. My father made one last desperate attempt. "Walter, be reasonable. Where are we supposed to go?" My grandfather fixed him with a stare that could have frozen fire. "You have a 5-bedroom house purchased with stolen money. Enjoy it while you can. The real estate fraud unit will be particularly interested in how a property purchased with trust fund money was titled in your names." The restaurant manager knocked tentatively on the door, poking his head in to ask if we needed anything else. The tension in the room was so thick it seemed to have its own gravitational pull. "Just the check," Walter said dismissively. "We're finished here." As the manager retreated, I looked around the table at these people, who were my family, wondering how I had never seen the truth before. My parents unable to meet my eyes. My grandfather steady as a rock beside me. Jennifer and Stanley efficient and professional in the face of this family implosion. Nothing would ever be the same after tonight. The foundations of my life had been revealed as lies, and I had no idea what would be left standing when the dust settled. The car ride home was silent and suffocating. I had declined Walter's offer to stay at one of his properties, needing the familiar comfort of my own apartment, shabby as it was. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, I watched my parents standing frozen on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, suddenly looking small and old in the harsh streetlight. When I walked through my apartment door, Olivia took one look at my face and knew something was terribly wrong. She guided me to the couch, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and waited patiently while I struggled to find words. "My parents stole $8 million from me." I finally said the words, sounding absurd even as they left my mouth. I told her everything, the story spilling out in disjointed pieces. The trust fund I never knew existed. The apartment that was supposed to be mine. The years of financial struggle that had been completely unnecessary. As I spoke, the shock began to give way to a bone-deep anger that I had never experienced before. "I applied for food stamps last year," I said, my voice breaking. "I was eating ramen for dinner 4 nights a week to save money, and they were using my trust fund to remodel their kitchen and buy luxury cars." Olivia held my hand tightly as I cycled through shock, rage, and grief. At some point, she made tea that grew cold on the coffee table. My phone buzzed constantly with texts and calls from my parents, which I ignored. The only message I responded to was from Walter, confirming that I was safe and asking if I needed anything. The next morning, Jennifer called with updates. Walter's legal team was moving quickly. They had already confirmed that the house in Florida, my parents' primary residence, and both their vehicles had been purchased using money from my trust. A forensic accountant was tracking down every withdrawal and transfer. The preliminary findings indicate that approximately $300,000 remains of the original trust, Jennifer explained in her efficient way. Most of the money went to real estate purchases, luxury items, and some high-risk investments that performed poorly. The days that followed passed in a blur. I took sick leave from my new job search, unable to focus on anything beyond the immediate crisis. Walter sent a car each day to bring me to meetings with attorneys, financial advisors, and eventually a therapist specializing in family trauma. A week after my birthday, we learned that my parents had purchased plane tickets to Panama 3 days before my birthday dinner. They had been planning to leave the country immediately after the celebration, apparently having realized that Walter might discover their deception at any moment. The only reason they hadn't fled already was that they needed to maintain appearances until after my birthday, which they knew Walter might attend. The extended family fractured along predictable lines. My father's siblings defended him, suggesting that Walter was overreacting to what was just poor financial management. My mother's side was more divided, with her sister calling me directly to apologize for what her sister had done. The most surprising ally came in the form of my cousin Natalie. She showed up at my apartment unannounced one afternoon, looking uncharacteristically subdued. I always wondered why Uncle Harold and Aunt Diane lived so well when Dad said our trust funds were basically the same size, she admitted, sitting uncomfortably on my worn couch. I guess now we know. It turned out that Natalie's trust had been properly managed but was much smaller than mine had been. She had been careful with her money, making it last while flaunting a lifestyle that was more modest than it appeared on social media. "I was always jealous of how close you seemed with your parents," she confessed. My parents were always honest about the money, but they were never really there for me emotionally. I thought you had both the loving parents and were being modest about your wealth. I never imagined they were stealing from you. That conversation was the beginning of an unexpected friendship with my cousin, one bright spot in the darkness that had engulfed my life. The legal proceedings moved forward relentlessly. Walter's team discovered that only about $300,000 remained of my original trust. The rest had been spent on my parents' lavish lifestyle or lost in bad investments. The house in Florida and their primary residence were both seized as they had been purchased directly with trust fund money. The cars, the boat, my father rarely used my mother's extensive jewelry collection, all documented and evaluated for potential recovery. Through it all, my parents continued their desperate attempts to contact me. The messages shifted from explanation attempts to outright begging as the legal consequences became clear. My father called from a hotel room claiming they had nowhere to go. My mother sent long emails about how everything they did was ultimately for my benefit, though she never managed to explain exactly how their luxury lifestyle had helped me in any way. The media caught wind of the story eventually. A business publication ran a small piece about Walter Harrington's family financial dispute. Though they didn't mention me by name, the article hinted at significant misappropriation of trust fund assets by close family members. I deleted all my social media accounts, temporarily unable to face questions from acquaintances who might connect the dots. The worst part was the constant gnawing feeling of guilt that plagued me despite being the victim. Had I somehow driven my parents to this? Should I have noticed something was wrong? Was I overreacting by allowing Walter's legal team to pursue them so aggressively? The therapist Walter had arranged for me explained that this was a common response for victims of familial betrayal, but understanding the psychology didn't make the feelings any less real. After 3 weeks of living in a fog of legal meetings and emotional turmoil, Walter invited me to dinner at his penthouse. The space was surprisingly warm and comfortable despite its obvious luxury. He fixed us both drinks himself, dismissing the staff for the evening to give us privacy. "I want you to know that none of this is your fault," he said, looking at me directly. "Your parents made their choices. They betrayed not only you, but the trust I placed in them." "I keep thinking I should have known," I admitted. "There were signs." "You had no reason to suspect your own parents of stealing from you," Walter replied firmly, "especially when you didn't even know the money existed." That night, Walter showed me photographs I had never seen before. My grandmother, who had died when I was too young to remember her. Walter as a young man building his first development. My mother as a child sitting on Walter's shoulders at a park. "Family is complicated," he said, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "Your grandmother and I didn't always see eye to eye on how to raise your mother. I was often too strict, too focused on building the business. Perhaps if I had been different, your mother might have developed a healthier relationship with money." It was the closest thing to vulnerability I had ever seen from my grandfather, and it helped me begin to understand that the betrayal had layers beyond my own pain. My parents had not only stolen from me, they had betrayed the father who had tried to secure his granddaughter's future. 1 month after my birthday, I finally agreed to meet with my parents. The legal mediation was scheduled at Walter's attorney's office, a sleek space in a downtown high-rise that made my parents look even more out of place than they already felt to me. They had visibly aged in the past month. My father's face was gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse. They were dressed in clothes I didn't recognize more modest than their usual attire. I later learned they had been forced to sell much of their designer wardrobe. The conference room was intimidatingly large for our small group. Walter sat beside me with Stanley and 2 other attorneys from his team nearby. My parents had a single lawyer, a nervous-looking man who kept shuffling his papers. The financial forensics team presented their findings with clinical precision. Charts and graphs detailed the systematic draining of my trust over 7 years. What had begun as borrowing small amounts had escalated to major withdrawals. The money had funded their house purchase, cars, expensive vacations, my mother's failed attempt to start a luxury real estate agency, and my father's disastrous foray into day trading. As the evidence mounted, my father's posture became increasingly defensive, while my mother simply stared at the table, occasionally wiping away tears. When the presentation concluded, Walter spoke directly to my parents. "The forensic accounting is complete. We know exactly where every dollar went. The only question remaining is whether this proceeds as a civil matter or whether criminal charges will be filed." My parents' attorney cleared his throat. "My clients are prepared to cooperate fully. They understand the gravity of their actions and wish to make amends to the extent possible." "Amends," I repeated, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. "You stole my future. You watched me struggle while you lived off money that was meant for me. How exactly do you plan to make amends for that?" My father couldn't meet my eyes. "Kaitlyn, we never meant for things to go this far. It started small, just borrowing a little, to get through a rough patch. Then it became easier to take a little more and a little more. We convinced ourselves we deserved it," my mother added quietly. "For raising you, for all the sacrifices we made as parents. We told ourselves we would pay it back before you ever needed to know." "And the apartment?" I asked. "The one Grandpa bought for me 2 years ago, what was your plan there?" They exchanged guilty glances. My father sighed heavily. "We were renting it out. The income was going into our account." The betrayal felt fresh all over again. While I had been sharing a cramped apartment with a roommate, they had been collecting rent on a luxury property that was supposed to be mine. Walter placed a steadying hand on my shoulder before addressing my parents. "Here are your options. Option 1. You sign over all remaining assets purchased with trust fund money, cooperate fully with recovery efforts, and agree to a structured repayment plan for what cannot be recovered immediately. In exchange, Kaitlyn agrees not to press criminal charges." My parents nodded eagerly. "Option 2, Walter continued, his voice hardening. You continue to obfuscate and defend your actions, in which case we proceed with criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and theft. The evidence is overwhelming. You would both face significant prison time." "We choose option 1, my father said quickly. "We'll cooperate completely." Walter looked to me. "Kaitlyn, the decision is yours." I studied my parents, these people who had raised me, who had tucked me in at night and cheered at my graduations. These same people who had systematically stolen my inheritance while watching me struggle. The conflicting emotions were overwhelming. "I don't want them in prison," I finally said. "But I want every penny recovered that can be recovered. And I want them to acknowledge exactly what they did, not just to me but to the entire family." The legal details were worked out over the next several hours. My parents signed document after document transferring assets and agreeing to the terms Walter's team had outlined. By the end of the day, I legally owned their house in Florida, which would be sold, and arrangements were made to recover as many of their possessions as possible for liquidation. When the attorneys stepped out to make copies, I found myself alone with my parents for the first time since my birthday. "Why?" I asked simply. "I want to understand how you could do this." My mother reached for my hand, and this time I didn't pull away. "We got caught up in a lifestyle we couldn't really afford. Your father made some bad investments early in our marriage, and we were always trying to catch up to keep appearances. When we had access to your trust, it seemed like an easy solution. Just a little to help us get ahead. But it never stopped. We have a problem with money," my father admitted, looking truly ashamed for the first time. "With spending, with status. We need help, professional help. That doesn't excuse what we did to you, but maybe it helps explain it." It wasn't enough. No explanation could ever be enough. But it was a start, a tiny crack in the wall of betrayal that stood between us. 2 weeks later, I moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment purchased with part of the recovered funds. It wasn't the luxury Gold Coast property that should have been mine, but it was mine free and clear with no mortgage or rent to worry about. Walter had helped me select it, insisting on security features and a good location near public transportation. With Walter's guidance, I began to learn about financial management. The recovered assets, including the Florida house and various liquidated possessions, amounted to just over $1 million, a fraction of what the trust should have been worth, but still a life-changing amount for someone who had been living paycheck to paycheck. A new job opportunity came through a connection of Walter's, a position at a respected design firm with better pay and advancement potential than my previous job. While I was initially hesitant to accept help that felt like nepotism, Walter pointed out that getting me the interview was all he had done. Earning the position had been entirely my achievement. As spring turned to summer, I began to establish new routines and boundaries. I allowed limited contact with my parents, accepting brief phone calls but declining their requests to visit. They had moved into a small rental apartment and were both in therapy for financial addiction, a term I had never heard before but which apparently described their behavior accurately. Walter and I grew closer, our weekly dinners becoming a fixture in my calendar. He taught me about investments and business with the same precision and attention to detail that had made him successful. I began to see past his gruff exterior to the complex, caring man beneath. Jennifer surprisingly became something of a friend as well. Having worked for Walter for over 15 years, she had stories about him that humanized him in ways I had never expected. She also proved to be an excellent mentor for professional development, helping me navigate office, politics, and career planning with her characteristic efficiency. Most unexpected was the reemergence of Thomas, a friend from college I had lost touch with. He reached out after seeing me at a coffee shop near my new apartment, and our reconnection felt like finding an anchor in stormy seas. He had no connection to my family drama, no preconceived notions about who I should be. With him, I could just be Kaitlyn, not the victim of a high-profile family betrayal. As summer faded into fall, I began to feel something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just for financial stability, but for rebuilding a life that was authentically mine, founded on truth rather than deception. 6 months after the revelation that changed everything, I found myself thriving in ways I would never have predicted. My position at the design firm had evolved from a basic graphic designer role to leading a small team working on a major rebranding project for a national client. The creative director had taken notice of my work and increasingly sought my input on high-profile assignments. Walter had helped me establish a proper financial foundation with the recovered funds. The approximately $1.2 million had been carefully invested, with a portion set aside for immediate security. I now had a retirement account, health insurance that actually covered more than catastrophic emergencies, and an emergency fund that would sustain me for a full year if necessary. For someone who had spent years counting pennies and worrying about unexpected expenses, the security was almost disorienting. I still found myself hesitating before making simple purchases, the habits of financial anxiety deeply ingrained despite my changed circumstances. My parents continued to struggle with the consequences of their actions. They had been forced to downsize, dramatically moving from their 5-bedroom house to a small 2-bedroom apartment in a modest neighborhood. My father had taken a position at a small insurance agency several steps down from his previous executive role. My mother had surrendered her real estate license as part of the legal settlement and was working as an administrative assistant. The social fallout had been perhaps the most difficult adjustment for them. Former friends had distanced themselves once the story spread through their social circle. They were no longer invited to the country club events and charity galas that had once been the center of their social calendar. After months of limited contact, I agreed to meet them for coffee at a neutral location. They arrived early, visibly nervous, bearing no gifts or overtures beyond their evident desire to reconnect. "We've been working with our therapist on making amends," my mother explained, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup. "Not just to you, but to Walter, to ourselves. We understand that we can't undo what we did. We're establishing boundaries with money," my father added. "Separate accounts, strict budgets, accountability partners. It's like being in recovery from any other addiction." I listened more than I spoke, observing the changes in them. There was a humility that had never been present before, an absence of the designer labels and status symbols that had once seemed so essential to their identity. Before we parted, my mother asked hesitantly if we could establish regular contact, perhaps a monthly lunch. I agreed to consider it, unwilling to commit but no longer completely closed to the possibility of a carefully constructed relationship. Walter had suffered a minor health scare in early fall, a warning from his doctor about his blood pressure that had resulted in lifestyle modifications and a reduced work schedule. The brush with mortality had softened him further, making him more reflective about family relationships despite the pain of betrayal. "Your grandmother always said that family was worth fighting for," he told me during one of our weekly dinners. "Not worth sacrificing your self-respect or safety, but worth the effort of understanding and forgiveness when possible." I was learning from Walter not just about financial management, but about resilience in the face of betrayal. He had been deeply hurt by my parents' actions, yet he maintained a steady presence in my life, never allowing his disappointment in them to affect his relationship with me. With Walter's encouragement, I had started a small side business in graphic design consulting, working with startup companies that couldn't afford full-service agencies. The work was challenging and rewarding, allowing me to build something that was entirely my own, independent of family connections or recovered funds. My confidence was growing not just professionally but personally. The therapy sessions that had begun as crisis management had evolved into a valuable tool for examining patterns and building healthier relationships. I was learning to trust my own judgment again, to recognize that I had been a victim not because of any failure on my part, but because those I trusted had made terrible choices. An unexpected development came in the form of a surprise dinner arranged by Walter 6 months to the day after my fateful birthday. He reserved a private dining room at a restaurant, even more exclusive than the one where our family had imploded. But this time, the atmosphere was entirely different. When I arrived, I found not just Walter, but also Jennifer Stanley, my cousin Natalie, and even Thomas, all gathered to celebrate what Walter called my half-birthday. "6 months ago, your life changed in ways no one could have predicted," Walter said, raising a glass in toast. "Tonight we celebrate not what was lost, but what you have built from the ashes." After dinner, Walter presented me with a small box. Inside was a key and a deed to a new apartment, modest but in a secure building with a short commute to my office. The Gold Coast property was sold as part of the recovery efforts, he explained. "This one is entirely yours, purchased with recovered funds, but selected specifically for your current life, not the one that was taken from you." The gesture moved me to tears, not because of the material value, but because it represented a clean break with the past, a fresh start untainted by betrayal. My relationship with Natalie had evolved from cautious connection to genuine friendship. Free from the artificial competition that had characterized our earlier interactions, we discovered shared interests and complementary personalities. She had even invested in my side business, providing capital for expansion in exchange for a modest equity stake, a transaction Walter had helped structure to ensure fairness for both of us. "I always thought you had the perfect family," she confessed during a lunch date. "It's strange how we envied each other for things that weren't even real." Thomas had become more than a friend in recent months, our coffee meetings evolving into dinner dates and long conversations that often continued late into the evening. He had been present through the worst of the aftermath without trying to fix or minimize my pain, simply offering steady support and occasional necessary distraction. When he kissed me for the first time on a walk along the lakeshore near my new apartment, it felt like crossing a threshold into a part of my life untouched by the betrayal. Here was something entirely new, a relationship built on a foundation of honesty from the beginning. I had begun using a portion of my recovered funds to establish a small mentorship program for young designers from disadvantaged backgrounds, providing scholarships for software training and professional development. The program was still in its infancy, but helping others who faced financial barriers to creative careers brought a sense of purpose that transcended my personal experience. As fall turned to winter, I realized that while the betrayal would always be part of my story, it no longer defined my daily existence. I was building something new, something authentic, from the painful truth rather than comfortable lies. 1 year after the birthday that changed everything, I found myself in a place I never could have imagined. Not just financially secure, but emotionally stronger, with clearer boundaries and deeper, more authentic relationships than I had before the betrayal. The healing journey had not been linear. There were still days when anger would surge unexpectedly, when the memory of those years of unnecessary struggle would feel fresh and raw. But those moments came less frequently, now subsumed by the full life I was building. My parents and I had established a cautious reconciliation process. We met monthly for lunch with clear boundaries and expectations. They had shown genuine remorse, continuing their therapy, and making small but consistent restitution payments that Walter's team had structured as part of their amends process. I never thought I would sit at a table with them again without feeling rage. I admitted to my therapist during one of our now bi-weekly sessions. It is not forgetting or even complete forgiveness yet, but it is something like peace. The financial education Walter had provided had transformed my relationship with money. I now managed my investments with confidence, understanding the balance between security and growth. The remaining trust funds, though far smaller than they should have been, were carefully managed to provide long-term stability while allowing me to live comfortably in the present. Walter had experienced another health scare more serious than the first that had required a brief hospitalization. The fragility of his mortality brought perspective to our family situation. Despite the betrayal, despite the legal consequences, he was still my grandfather and my parents' father. The time we had together was limited and precious, even with the shadow of past actions. During his recovery, I had spent hours at his bedside learning more about his early years, his relationship with my grandmother, his regrets and triumphs. These conversations deepened my understanding not just of him but of the complex family dynamics that had contributed, though never excused my parents' actions. My design career had flourished, with my side business growing to the point where I was considering whether to pursue it full-time. I had hired 2 junior designers to help with the increasing client load and a business manager to handle the administrative aspects that I had little interest in. The mentorship program had expanded as well, with 5 young designers now receiving scholarships and professional guidance. Watching them grow in confidence and skill brought a satisfaction unlike anything I had experienced professionally before. Thomas and I had grown steadily closer, our relationship built on a foundation of transparency that I now recognized had been missing from most of my previous relationships, familial and romantic alike. He had his own apartment but spent most nights at mine, our lives intertwining in a way that felt natural and unforced. "You know what amazes me most about you," he said one evening as we cooked dinner together in my kitchen. "How you've taken something that could have made you bitter and turned it into growth instead." The apartment had truly become my home, filled with art and books that reflected my taste, decorated in colors that brought me joy. It was modest compared to what might have been mine, had the trust remained intact, but it was fully mine in a way the Gold Coast property never would have been. My cousin Natalie and I had developed a genuine friendship that had surprised us both. The artificial competition that had characterized our earlier relationship had given way to mutual support and understanding. She had even joined the board of the mentorship program, contributing both funds and connections. On the anniversary of the revelation, I hosted a small gathering at my apartment. Walter was there, looking frailer than I like to admit, but still sharp as ever. Natalie and Thomas Jennifer, and a few close friends from work. Notably absent were my parents, not because they weren't invited, but because they had recognized that this particular milestone was not one they should be part of. As we shared a meal around my dining table, I looked at these people who had become my chosen family and felt a surge of gratitude that nearly overwhelmed me. "A year ago, I thought my life was destroyed," I said, raising my glass in toast. "What I've learned since then is that when the foundation is revealed to be false, you have the opportunity to build something true in its place." Walter nodded approval, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "To truth," he said, simply raising his glass to meet mine. "To truth," the others echoed. Later, after the guests had gone and only Thomas remained helping me load the dishwasher in comfortable silence, I reflected on the deeper lessons of the past year. I had learned that financial wealth, while providing security and opportunity, was not the most valuable currency. Trust, authenticity, and self-knowledge were far more precious and much harder to rebuild once broken. I had learned that forgiveness was not a single act but a process, one that did not require forgetting or excusing, but did eventually lead to a lightening of the burden of anger. Most importantly, I had learned that while we cannot choose what happens to us, we have absolute sovereignty over how we respond over what we build from both gifts and wreckage. The betrayal would always be part of my story, a chapter I could not erase. But it would not be the defining chapter, merely the one that forced me to take control of the narrative and write the rest with intention and authenticity. If you've stayed with me through this story, I want to thank you for witnessing my journey. Have you ever experienced a betrayal that ultimately led to unexpected growth? Or have you had to rebuild trust after it was broken? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that even the deepest betrayals can lead to new beginnings. Remember, sometimes the most painful truths are the ones that ultimately set us free.